Have you ever heard someone say their bone density keeps getting worse? Even though they eat all the right foods? They drink milk faithfully, eat their calcium-rich foods, even take supplements, and yet their bones keep weakening anyway. What if the answer isn't eating more calcium at all? Today we're tackling two common misunderstandings about calcium. The first is that any food high in calcium is automatically good for your bones. The second is that as long as you eat enough calcium, it automatically ends up in your bones. Once we clear up these two misunderstandings, your entire approach to eating for bone health might change. Stick around, because I'll walk you through exactly what this means. For your dinner table, when my own mother got a concerning bone density result, I assumed it had to be low calcium intake. But after a nutrition consultation, it turned out her calcium intake wasn't actually the problem. That's when I first learned that how much calcium you eat and how much your body actually uses are two completely different things. Osteoporosis often progresses silently, without obvious pain, which is why it's sometimes called a silent disease, frequently only discovered after a bone actually breaks. That's exactly why consistent management matters. But the real issue is that many people are managing it with their effort pointed in slightly the wrong direction. Eating calcium-rich foods is genuinely a good habit, but you need to understand two more pieces to make sure that effort actually translates into stronger bones. You've probably heard this before: calcium is the best thing for your bones. So eat as much calcium-rich food as possible. Calcium is absolutely essential for bone health, that part is true. But here's what people miss. No matter how much calcium a food contains, how much your body can actually absorb and use is an entirely separate question. This is called absorption rate. If a food contains 100 milligrams of calcium, your body doesn't necessarily absorb all 100 milligrams. The percentage that actually gets absorbed during digestion varies significantly, depending on the food, and one major factor influencing that rate is what other compounds happen to be present alongside the calcium. To put it more concretely, calcium gets absorbed in your intestines through two pathways: an active transport route and a passive route that follows concentration gradients. But if a food also contains compounds that bind tightly to calcium and form indigestible compounds, both absorption pathways get blocked. The calcium essentially passes straight through and exits with waste. So looking only at the calcium number on a nutrition label to judge how good a food is for your bones is a bit like checking your bank balance without checking how much of it you can actually spend. Here's what surprises people. Some vegetables known for high calcium content actually have surprisingly low absorption rates. Spinach is the classic example. Spinach does contain a fair amount of calcium, but it also contains oxalic acid, which binds to calcium and turns it into a form your body can't absorb. So no matter how much spinach you eat, a large portion of that calcium passes right through unused. Oxalic acid shows up in other foods too, like Swiss chard, beet greens, and some nuts. That doesn't mean you should avoid them entirely. They're still valuable for fiber and other nutrients. But if calcium is your specific goal, absorption rate matters as much as the number on the label. Now here's an important tip. Green vegetables low in oxalic acid tell a completely different story. Kale is a great example. Research measuring calcium absorption from kale found it was actually higher than the absorption rate from milk. Specifically, kale's calcium absorption rate measured around 41%, while milk's absorption rate under the same conditions measured around 32%. Comparing equal amounts of calcium from each, more of kale's calcium actually gets absorbed into your body. This research tracked how much calcium was actually absorbed in healthy women given labeled kale and milk, and the difference was statistically significant. Broccoli and cabbage, also low in oxalic acid, show similarly favorable absorption rates comparable to milk. Here's probably your biggest question. Does this mean kale has more usable calcium than milk or dried small fish overall? Honestly, no. The absolute amount of calcium in a cup of kale is much lower than what you'd get from a glass of milk or a serving of small fish eaten with the bones. The point today isn't to flip the ranking of which food has more calcium. It's that absorption rate deserves to be considered alongside total content. This matters especially if your digestion isn't what it used to be, or if dairy doesn't agree with you, since these vegetables can be a genuinely useful addition. One common misunderstanding worth addressing: hearing that kale absorbs well doesn't mean a couple bites of kale covers your entire daily calcium need. Good absorption rate means a higher percentage of whatever calcium you eat gets used, not that the food contains unlimited calcium. So pairing absorption-friendly foods with an overall adequate daily calcium intake from multiple sources is what actually matters. But the story doesn't end there. Here's a mistake a lot of people make, so let's address it now. Even if you're eating calcium from foods with great absorption rates, that alone doesn't complete the picture. There's a second checkpoint. Does that absorbed calcium actually make it to your bones? Or does it end up somewhere it shouldn't? This is where vitamin K2 comes in. The name might sound unfamiliar, but it's particularly abundant in fermented foods. Traditional Korean cheonggukjang and Japanese natto, both fermented soybean dishes, are well-known sources. There's an important distinction worth understanding here. The vitamin K found in leafy greens like spinach and broccoli is a different form, called vitamin K1, primarily involved in blood clotting. Vitamin K2, which we're discussing today, is mainly found in fermented foods, and is more closely tied to bone metabolism specifically. Both fall under the broader vitamin K category, but they play different roles and follow different absorption pathways in the body. Here's a simple way to understand K2's role. Your body has a protein called osteocalcin, and that protein needs to be activated before calcium can properly bind to your bones. Vitamin K2 is essentially the key that activates osteocalcin. Think of calcium as a package and vitamin K2 as the delivery person who makes sure that package actually reaches the right address, your bones. Without the delivery person, no matter how many packages you send, they don't arrive where they're needed, and end up piling up somewhere else instead. Digging a bit deeper, osteocalcin starts out inactive and needs to go through a chemical process called carboxylation to become active. Vitamin K2 serves as an essential cofactor for that carboxylation process. Osteocalcin that hasn't been activated can't properly bind calcium, meaning that even with plenty of calcium circulating in your blood, it may not find its way to your bones effectively. Research has found that even in healthy individuals, nearly half of circulating osteocalcin can remain uncarboxylated or inactive, which some researchers interpret as a sign that vitamin K2 intake commonly falls short. Here's a concerning follow-up question. Where does that unused calcium go instead? Some researchers point to the possibility that this misdirected calcium may accumulate in unwanted places, like artery walls. Cases where calcium intake is adequate but bone density remains low, sometimes alongside vascular calcification, are sometimes referred to by researchers as the calcium paradox. This remains an active area of research, though, and not everything here has been definitively established. Research has repeatedly found that when vitamin K2 is insufficient, osteocalcin doesn't get adequately activated to direct calcium toward bone. A meta-analysis published in an international journal found that vitamin K2 supplementation led to meaningful improvements in bone formation markers. That said, whether K2 supplementation meaningfully increases bone density or reduces fracture risk shows mixed results across studies, so it's not something all experts agree on definitively. Still, many researchers point out that pairing calcium with vitamin K2 makes theoretical sense as a more complete approach than calcium alone. Several studies conducted in Japan have observed differences in fracture rates between regions, with higher versus lower natto consumption. Observational data alone can't prove direct cause and effect, since other regional lifestyle and dietary factors could also play a role. But these observations align directionally with the bone metabolism mechanism we just discussed, which is why fermented soy foods are supported both by theory and by some observational research. So what can you actually start doing today? Broadly, there are two directions: eating calcium foods with better absorption, and adding vitamin K2-rich fermented foods. First, gradually increase low-oxalate green vegetables like kale, broccoli, and cabbage in your diet. Blanch or sauté kale and serve it like a seasoned side Dish, or add it to soybean paste soup. If kale tastes a bit bitter or tough, raw, blanch it briefly, rinse in cold water. Then season with perilla oil, minced garlic, and a little soy sauce for a familiar side dish texture. Broccoli works well lightly blanched with a dip or stir-fried. Cabbage can be worked in naturally through kimchi or cabbage soup, foods you're likely already familiar with. Second, include fermented soybean foods like cheonggukjang or natto in your diet several times a week. Cheonggukjang stew is already familiar to many, and adding plenty of garlic and vegetables makes it an even more balanced meal. If the strong smell is off, pudding, powdered cheonggukjang can be stirred into soups or stews in smaller amounts. Beyond cheonggukjang, other traditional fermented foods like soybean paste, soy sauce, and well-aged kimchi likely offer some benefit too, since they're also products of fermentation. Making a conscious effort to include these traditional foods a bit more often can help naturally. Keep in mind these fermented foods tend to be higher in sodium, so balance matters. Which brings us to the next point. Third, spread your calcium intake across 3 meals. Rather than loading up at one sitting, your body has a limited capacity to process large amounts of calcium at once. So having some at breakfast, lunch, and dinner is more efficient than concentrating it all in one meal. If you tend to skip breakfast, this might be a good moment to add something small, spreading your calcium timing more evenly throughout the day. Fourth, since vitamin K2 is fat-soluble, pairing it with some oil helps absorption. Add a bit of perilla or sesame oil to your cheonggukjang stew, or drizzle some over seasoned vegetables. Fat-soluble vitamins dissolve in fat rather than water, so eating vitamin K2-rich foods completely without any fat may mean it passes through without being properly absorbed. Adding a touch of oil isn't just about flavor. It has a genuine nutritional purpose here, and you can use oils already common in your kitchen. Fifth, don't forget vitamin D. Vitamin D opens the first gateway for calcium absorption in your intestines. So even with great absorption rate, calcium and plenty of vitamin K2 insufficient. Vitamin D means the whole process doesn't run smoothly. Try to build in 20 to 30 minutes of sunlight exposure through a daily walk. And if winter or limited outdoor time makes this difficult, consider discussing supplements with your doctor. Vitamin D essentially opens and activates special channels in your intestinal cells that allow calcium through without enough vitamin D. Those channels don't open fully, no matter how much good calcium you're eating. Sixth, moderate your caffeine and sodium intake. Too much coffee or excessive salt increases how much calcium gets excreted in urine, meaning calcium you worked hard to absorb ends up leaving your body anyway. Try limiting coffee to 1 or 2 cups daily, and lean toward lighter seasoning in soups and stews. Seventh, pay attention to protein intake as well. Too little protein can weaken the structural framework of your bones, while some research suggests excessive protein may increase calcium excretion. Getting balanced protein from beans, tofu, fish, and lean meat supports bone health too. Tofu in particular offers both protein and some calcium, making it a good pairing with the kale or cheonggukjang we discussed. Eighth, remember that small fish eaten with bones remains an excellent calcium source. Nothing about today's discussion means you should stop eating anchovies or other small bony fish you've been enjoying. In fact, eating a variety of these foods together is the ideal approach. Keep your existing dishes, seasoned anchovies, dried fish preparations, and simply add the vegetables and fermented foods we discussed today on top of what you're already doing. Here's a mistake worth flagging. Many people focus entirely on supplements and pills while neglecting the weight-bearing exercise that actually stimulates bone. Bone, like muscle, gets stronger under appropriate load, no matter how well you manage calcium and vitamins. Without enough bone-stimulating movement, that effort won't reach its full potential. Bone is actually a far more dynamic tissue than people assume. Walking or climbing stairs sends mechanical signals to bone cells that stimulate new bone formation. Conversely, extended periods of inactivity mean bone doesn't receive those signals and can weaken, even with excellent calcium intake. Around 30 minutes of walking, stair climbing, or light resistance exercise Using bands, done 3 to 4 times a week, is a reasonable target. If you've already been diagnosed with osteoporosis, check with your doctor or physical therapist about which exercises are safe for you first. Now let's talk about when self-care crosses into doctor territory. Everything discussed today genuinely helps manage bone health through diet. But it isn't a cure-all for existing osteoporosis. Osteoporosis can only be accurately diagnosed through bone density testing, and depending on results, medication may be necessary. See a doctor if any of these apply. You're postmenopausal or over 65 and haven't had a bone density scan yet. You've broken a bone from a minor impact, which suggests osteoporosis may have already progressed significantly. Your height has noticeably decreased or you're developing a stooped posture, which can signal accumulating microfractures in the spine. You have family history of osteoporosis or hip fracture. You're on long-term steroid medication or have another condition, like thyroid disease that affects bone density. Bone density testing itself is painless and quick, using an X-ray-based method to measure bone density. Results are typically expressed as a T-score, where lower numbers indicate lower density, calculated by comparing you to the average bone density of a healthy young adult. If you've never had this test and you're postmenopausal or over 65, getting one even without symptoms is generally recommended as a preventive measure. On height loss specifically, some gradual height decrease with age is normal. But a noticeable drop of a couple inches or more over a few years can indicate spinal compression fractures have already occurred. These fractures often progress without severe pain, sometimes accumulating across multiple vertebrae before anyone notices. Don't dismiss changes in height or posture, get them checked. If you're on blood-thinning medication, particularly warfarin, talk to your doctor before significantly increasing vitamin K2 intake, since K2 can interact with how these medications work. If you want to eat more changgukjang or natto than usual, check with your doctor first. Kidney function matters here too. Kidneys play a central role in regulating calcium and phosphorus balance, and impaired kidney function can disrupt normal calcium metabolism. In these cases, dietary calcium intake should be adjusted individually with your doctor, and increasing calcium or vitamin supplements on your own isn't advisable. If you've had kidney stones before, current thinking has shifted somewhat. Moderate dietary calcium from food may actually help prevent stones rather than strictly limiting it, but this varies significantly by stone type and history. So discuss your specific situation with your doctor. If you're already diagnosed with osteoporosis and on medication, everything discussed today is meant to complement, not replace, that treatment. Never adjust or stop prescribed medication on your own. And if you're considering dietary changes or new supplements, tell your doctor first. If you're considering K2 supplements specifically, and you're already on other medications, checking for interactions is essential. Getting these nutrients from food, as discussed today, is generally preferable to supplements when possible. If a supplement seems necessary, confirm appropriate dosing with your doctor rather than purchasing on your own. Let's put together a practical 7-day plan. Days 1 and 2, check your fridge and pantry, and add kale, broccoli, and fermented soy foods like changgukjang or natto to your shopping list. Days 3 and 4, prepare one dish each using these ingredients. Days 5 and 6, practice spreading calcium across 3 meals and add a 20-minute sunlight walk. Day 7, take stock, and if you haven't had a bone density scan yet, this is a good moment to schedule one. Consider keeping a simple log during this week, tracking how many meals included calcium-rich foods and how many times you had fermented soy foods. Don't aim for perfection at every meal. Aim for gradual increases 2 or 3 times a week, which feels far more manageable. If you cook for family, working these ingredients naturally into everyone's meals is a good approach too. If you have growing children or grandchildren, bone density established early in life matters for lifelong bone health. So building these habits as a family can be meaningful. Bone density isn't something you feel change day to day. It's typically confirmed through testing over months or a year. Bone is constantly being broken down and rebuilt throughout life. So today's dietary changes won't show up on tomorrow's scan, but consistent changes over months and years. genuinely influence that rebuilding process. Think of each spoonful of well-absorbed calcium and vitamin K2 today as a small deposit toward your future bone health. We're generally good at seeking out calcium-rich foods, but we rarely think about the actual journey that calcium takes. Once it's inside us, whether it's absorbed well, and whether that absorbed calcium actually reaches your bones. Both checkpoints need to be cleared before it genuinely helps. Why not add one absorption-friendly vegetable and one fermented soy dish to your table starting today? Growing up, when we think of bone-healthy food, milk and small fish usually come to mind first, and they're still excellent calcium sources. But as we've covered today, the bigger picture of bone health includes absorption rate and vitamin K2, the hidden piece that guides absorbed calcium toward your bones. Piece these elements together, one at a time, and you'll be building a genuinely complete picture of bone health. To sum up, calcium quality matters more than sheer calcium quantity, and even well absorbed. Calcium needs vitamin K2 to actually reach your bones. Pair low oxalate greens like kale with fermented soy foods like cheonggukjang or natto. And if any of the warning signs we discussed apply to you, don't hesitate to see a doctor. Start with these habits today, and if you've had a similar experience or found something that worked for you, share it in the comments. I'll see you in the next video with more health information you can actually use. If this helped, a subscribe and a like go a long way. Thank you for watching.